1981, the Rank organization quietly abandoned its television and radio manufacturing operations in Britain, erasing the engineering independence of Bush and Murphy in a single corporate retreat. Assembly lines went silent. High-street electrical shops lost two of the most familiar domestic badges of the 20th century. A combined workforce of thousands who had spent decades building the cabinets, tuning dials, and printed circuit boards that soundtracked the British home were suddenly displaced by an era of imported electronics. A decade earlier, that same combined entity, Rank Bush Murphy, had been designed to mean precisely the opposite. It was supposed to be the definitive British industrial fortress, an empire vast enough to repel foreign competition and dominate the high street shop window forever. But the real story of Rank Bush Murphy is not just the story of a 1981 factory closure. It is the story of what happens when a market demands cheap convenience and a corporate conglomerate assumes that simply gluing a trusted historic badge onto a generic plastic chassis is enough to keep Britain tuning in. Every week, we tell the stories of British radios, wireless makers, and the listening habits that once shaped how Britain heard voices, music, and memory, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, in Welwyn Garden City, in 1929. To understand the corporate tragedy of Rank Bush Murphy, one must first look at the two separate foundations upon which it was built. Long before the Rank organization decided that two distinct engineering cultures could be welded together to save money, Bush and Murphy were entirely different propositions, born to solve different problems in the British radio market. In the late 1920s, British broadcasting was becoming a daily domestic habit. The BBC, operating from Savoy Hill, and soon to move into the purpose-built broadcasting house in London, was transmitting a reliable schedule of news, music, and talks. The signal from the Daventry transmitter was strong enough to reach across the country. Yet, the physical apparatus used to receive these voices was often highly flawed. The British sitting room was filled with early wireless sets, an older British term for a radio receiver that brings broadcast signals into the home without a physical program source. Many of these early sets were either crude, exposed scientific instruments requiring technical skill to operate, or they were housed in absurdly ornate cabinets designed to look like Tudor furniture. The market lacked receivers that were reliable, affordable, and honest in their design. In 1929, two engineers named Frank Murphy and E.J. Power decided to correct this absence. They established Murphy Radio in Welwyn Garden City, a newly developed town in Hertfordshire. Frank Murphy was a man who despised unnecessary decoration and misleading marketing. His philosophy was simple: a radio receiver, a device that selects a broadcast signal from the air and turns it into sound, should look like a modern electrical instrument, not a fake antique. Murphy Radio introduced a completely new ethos to the British High Street. In 1931, the company launched the Murphy A3, a mains radio, a receiver powered directly by the household electricity supply rather than heavy leaking acid batteries. The cabinet for the A3 was designed not by an engineer, but by the celebrated British furniture designer Gordon Russell. It was austere, functional, and striking. It featured a simple walnut cabinet with clean lines and no decorative fretwork over the loudspeaker, the part of a radio that turns the electrical signal into sound moving through air. But Frank Murphy did not just innovate in cabinet design. He revolutionized how British radios were sold. He fundamentally distrusted the average high-street electrical shop, believing that most retailers cared only about shifting boxes and lacked the technical knowledge to support the listener. In response, he created the Murphy Dealer Network. A shop could only sell a Murphy radio if its staff passed technical interviews, demonstrated a thorough understanding of valve radio circuitry and maintained a dedicated repair bench. A valve radio, a radio that uses glass electronic valves to amplify and process signals before the transistor era, was a complex piece of equipment that required occasional maintenance. By restricting sales to approved dealers, Murphy guaranteed that the badge on the cabinet represented absolute engineering integrity. The strategy worked. By the mid-1930s, the Welwyn Garden City factory was employing hundreds of workers, and the Murphy name became shorthand for serious, uncompromising British broadcasting quality. Just 30 miles away, an entirely different kind of wireless empire was being built. In 1932, Bush Radio was established in Shepherd's Bush, West London. While Murphy was founded on engineering purity, Bush was born from the entertainment industry. The company was originally established as a subsidiary of the Gaumont British Picture Corporation, a massive film and cinema conglomerate. If Murphy wanted to build the perfect acoustic instrument for the serious listener, Bush wanted to build a cheerful, reliable, and highly marketable box that would bring the BBC into every working-class and middle-class home in the country. Bush Radio quickly outgrew its original Shepherd's Bush premises and moved to a sprawling new factory on Power Road in Chiswick. They adopted the famous Bush Tree logo, a symbol of sturdy, rooted reliability that would soon become one of the most recognized domestic trademarks in Britain. Their early receivers, such as the SAC-21, were not designed to win architectural awards. They were designed to be incredibly robust, easy to operate, and affordable for a family saving up their weekly shillings. Bush understood that the tuning dial, the scale or display that shows which station or frequency the radio is tuned to, was the primary interface between the listener and the outside world. They made their dials large, clearly illuminated, and marked with the names of British and European transmitter stations: London, Droitwich, Hilversum, Luxembourg. A Bush radio was designed to make the invisible geography of the airwaves feel accessible to anyone who could turn a knob. By 1938, the British radio market was neatly divided by these two philosophies. The Murphy factory in Welwyn Garden City catered to the discerning, design-conscious professional who wanted a receiver built without compromise. The Bush factory in Chiswick catered to the mass market, providing a dependable, warm-sounding companion for the kitchen or the front room. They were fierce competitors, separated by design language, target audiences, and retail strategies. Yet, both brands shared one crucial characteristic. They were fiercely independent, and they controlled every aspect of their production. Their cabinets, tuning capacitors, metal chassis, and printed service manuals were designed and assembled in Britain by British workers for British listeners. When a customer bought a Murphy from a vetted dealer or a Bush from a high-street catalog, they were buying a complete, self-contained ecosystem of trust. As the shadow of the Second World War approached, both factories were drafted into military service, building vital communications equipment and radar components. They emerged from the conflict as national institutions. The 1950s lay ahead, the era that would define their absolute breakthrough into the cultural fabric of the nation, producing designs that are still recognized today, long before any corporate accountant decided that two distinct empires should be merged into one. By the dawn of the 1950s, the British domestic landscape was fundamentally shifting. The Second World War had cemented the BBC as the absolute voice of the nation. The home service and the light program were no longer just novelties. They were the rhythmic pulse of the daily household routine. To meet this demand, both Bush and Murphy released products that did not merely capture the market. They defined what a British wireless set should be, creating the immense brand value that the Rank organization would later attempt to exploit. For Bush Radio, the absolute breakthrough into the national consciousness arrived in 1950 with the release of the DAC-90A. It was a table radio, a radio designed to sit on furniture rather than be carried in a pocket. By modern standards, it was a heavy, glowing, heat-producing object, but in the austerity of post-war Britain, it was a masterpiece of domestic packaging. The DAC-90A was housed in a beautifully smooth, curved Bakelite cabinet. Bakelite, an early hard plastic used for many radio cabinets, strong, moldable, and visually distinctive, allowed Bush to mass-produce a set that looked entirely modern but remained relatively cheap to manufacture. The genius of the DAC-90A was its accessibility. Earlier wireless sets often required a long wire aerial, a wire strung across the garden or the sitting room to receive radio waves from the air, and a separate earth connection. The DAC-90A, however, featured a built-in frame aerial. A listener simply took it out of the box, plugged it into the household electricity supply, and waited for the valves to warm up. It was an AC-DC mains radio, meaning it could operate on the confusing variety of electrical supplies that still existed across British towns before the national grid was fully standardized. It sold in staggering numbers. At a price of around $12.10, nearly 2 weeks' wages for an average working man at the time, it was an investment, but one that was attainable through hire purchase agreements in high-street electrical shops and local radio dealers. The smell of hot Bakelite and the warm, golden glow of its tuning dial became the defining sensory experience of the British winter evening. While Bush was dominating the mass-market sideboard, Murphy Radio was cementing its reputation among those who viewed listening as a serious, almost architectural pursuit. Murphy's breakthrough was not about mass convenience, but about acoustic truth. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, Murphy introduced a series of baffle-board receivers, such as the A104. Most radio manufacturers put their components into a hollow wooden box, which inevitably acted as an echo chamber, coloring the sound with a boomy, unnatural bass. Murphy's engineers simply removed the box. The A104 was essentially a flat, beautifully veneered wooden panel holding the loudspeaker, the part of a radio that turns the electrical signal into sound moving through air, with the heavy metal chassis bolted to the back. It looked like a piece of modernist sculpture. It was a radical design that required the listener to understand the physics of sound propagation. It was not sold in standard department stores. It was sold exclusively through the strict Murphy dealer network. When a customer walked into a Murphy shop, the technician behind the service counter did not just sell the set. They explained the acoustics, delivered the heavy receiver to the customer's sitting room, and ensured it was placed correctly in the room to maximize the audio fidelity of a live BBC symphony broadcast. Then came the technological earthquake that would reshape the industry entirely. The transistor. A transistor, a small electronic component that controls or amplifies signals with less heat and power than a glass valve, allowed a radio to be truly portable, running instantly on standard batteries without needing time to warm up. In 1959, Bush released what is arguably the most famous British radio ever made, the Bush TR-82. It was a portable radio, a radio designed to be moved from room to room or taken outdoors. Designed by David Ogle, the TR-82 was a visual triumph of plastic and chrome. It featured a large, readable tuning dial, a sturdy carrying handle, and a robust cabinet that could survive being bumped against a kitchen counter or dropped on a picnic blanket. Crucially, it used a ferrite rod aerial, a small internal aerial often used in portable radios for medium-wave reception, which made it incredibly directional. A listener could physically turn the radio on the kitchen table to reduce interference. Unwanted noise or disturbance added to the broadcast signal. The TR-82 cost exactly 22 guineas upon launch. It was an enormous sum for a portable device, yet it became the absolute standard of British youth and domestic culture. Teenagers used it to hunt for the fading, crackling signal of Radio Luxembourg under the bed covers. Mothers placed it beside the sink to listen to. Two-way family favorites. Fathers carried it into the garden to hear the cricket on Test Match Special. It was sold through Curry's High Street windows, featured in mail-order catalogs, reviewed in Practical Wireless magazine, and kept alive by thousands of independent repair benches across the country. By the dawn of the 1960s, Bush and Murphy had built an impenetrable moat around the British listener. They had conquered the high street, the specialist dealer, the sitting room, and the picnic blanket. Their receivers were trusted by Radio Times readers, respected by amateur radio clubs, and relied upon by millions of ordinary families. The badge on the dial was not decoration. It was a promise about reception. By 1962, the British consumer electronics market was expanding at an unprecedented rate. Post-war austerity had firmly ended. The BBC was expanding its broadcasting hours, and the demand for portable radios, table sets, and the increasingly dominant television receiver was soaring. To survive this massive national demand, companies believed they needed absolute scale. The Rank organization, a colossal British entertainment conglomerate famous for its cinemas and film studios, already owned Bush Radio. But Rank wanted total dominance over the British sitting room. In June 1962, Rank acquired Murphy Radio. The purchase, estimated at around £3 million, brought two of Britain's most trusted engineering names under a single corporate umbrella. The new entity was formally named Rank Bush Murphy, or RBM. On paper, it was an industrial fortress designed to conquer the British high street and repel any future foreign competition. The scale of the RBM empire in the 1960s was staggering. The combined manufacturing might stretch across the country. There was the original Bush facility in Chiswick, West London. There was the sprawling, ultra-modern television and radio plant at Ernesettle in Plymouth, Devon, which Bush had opened in the 1950s to cope with post-war demand. And now there was the famous Murphy facility in Welwyn Garden City, Hertfordshire. Together, these sites employed many thousands of British workers, cabinet makers, assembly line soldierers, acoustic engineers, and testing technicians. RBM was no longer just a radio company. It was a fundamental pillar of British domestic infrastructure. If a listener walked down any high street in Britain in the mid-1960s, they could not escape the reach of Rank Bush Murphy. In independent radio shops, the Murphy badge still commanded respect, promising serious acoustic fidelity and robust construction for the discerning listener. In mass-market electrical chains like Curry's or the local co-op electrical department, the Bush logo promised cheerful, highly accessible reliability for the kitchen or the bedroom. Furthermore, RBM heavily supplied the massive radio rental networks, a business model where customers rented radio or television equipment rather than buying it outright. A family could rent a Bush radio or television for a few shillings a week, meaning RBM products penetrated even the most price-sensitive households. The high street sold them, the BBC broadcast to them, the British public trusted them. The mid-1960s represented the absolute zenith of British domestic listening culture, and RBM was perfectly positioned to soundtrack it. When the BBC launched Radio 1 in 1967 to cater to the explosion of youth pop culture, the signal was received by millions of teenagers clutching Bush transistor radios. A transistor radio, a portable radio that uses small semiconductor devices instead of valves, making it lighter, cooler, and more battery-friendly, was the essential teenage possession. Bush's plastic and chrome portables, often derived from the iconic TR-82 shape, were the definitive British answer to the format. In the sitting room, the ultimate status symbol of the era was the RBM radiogram, a piece of furniture combining a radio, amplifier, loudspeaker, and record player in one cabinet. These were massive, veneered wooden consoles, often badged as Murphy to leverage the brand's historic acoustic prestige. They featured beautifully illuminated tuning dials, heavy glass scales printed with the names of European transmitters, and tone controls, the control that changes the balance of bass and treble to adjust the sound of a long-playing record or a live BBC symphony broadcast. They also featured the newer VHF FFM band, a radio band that gives clearer sound over shorter distances than older AM bands, allowing listeners to hear the home service without the crackle of medium-wave interference. At this peak, Rank Bush Murphy produced millions of units annually. Their printed circuit boards, a board carrying electronic components and copper tracks that connect them, were assembled by legions of British women in Plymouth and Welwyn Garden City. Their cabinets were crafted from British wood and plastics. Their engineering departments were vast, employing some of the sharpest acoustic and electrical minds in the country. For a brief period in the 1960s, a Bush or Murphy radio sitting on a British high street shelf was not merely a consumer product. It was an anchor of domestic life, a trusted box of wood, plastic, and circuitry that a family expected to last for decades. The Ernesettle factory in Plymouth was not merely a manufacturing plant, it was a marvel of post-war British industrial planning. Spread across dozens of acres, it was designed to ingest raw materials and output the soundtrack of the nation. Components arrived daily from a vast network of domestic suppliers, glass valves from Mullard, tuning dials printed in London, loudspeakers wound in the Midlands. Inside the factory, thousands of workers sat at long benches, their soldering irons fusing copper tracks onto printed circuit boards in a haze of rosin flux. The sheer volume of output was staggering. By the late 1960s, industry estimates suggest Rank Bush Murphy was producing well over 1 million televisions and radio receivers annually, feeding a relentless, insatiable high-street demand. This output flowed directly into the arteries of British retail. High-street electrical shops, independent dealers, and massive rental chains like Radio Rentals and Rediffusion relied heavily on RBM's engineering. Radio Rental, a business model where customers rented radio or television equipment rather than buying it outright, was the financial engine of British consumer electronics. A working-class family could upgrade their Bush table radio or rent a new Murphy television for a few shillings a week, securing access to the latest broadcasting technology without the burden of a massive upfront purchase. Crucially, the service engineers who maintained these sets across the country knew the RBM chassis inside out. The equipment was reliable, logical, and explicitly built with repairability in mind. If a tuning capacitor, a component that changes the circuit's tuning so the radio can select one station from many, failed after 5 years of daily use, a local high-street technician could simply order the part from a catalog, unscrew the back panel, and replace the component on the repair bench. It was a closed loop of British manufacturing, British sales, and British maintenance. The cultural integration of these sets was absolute. The long-wave signal from the towering Droitwich transmitting station in Worcestershire blanketed the nation, and Rank Bush Murphy built the precise tools required to capture it. In 1966, Bush introduced the TR-130 transistor radio, the natural successor to the TR-82. It quickly became the best-selling radio in Britain. It was a ubiquitous object, found resting on construction site scaffolding, perched on the dashboards of British cars, tucked into holiday caravans, and sitting beside the kettle in millions of kitchens. It possessed excellent sensitivity, how well a radio picks up weak signals, making it the definitive companion for listeners tuning into the newly established BBC Radio 1, or hunting for the fading signals of illicit pirate ships anchored off the coast. While Bush conquered the portable and mass market, the Rank organization deliberately positioned the Murphy name at the premium end of their catalog. Murphy-branded receivers and radiograms were marketed to the discerning listener who still remembered Frank Murphy's original acoustic ethos. They were celebrated for their selectivity, how well a radio separates one station from nearby stations, and their superior, acoustically tuned cabinetry. A Murphy radiogram occupying the corner of a sitting room in 1968, finished in rich teak or walnut veneer with a heavy glass tuning scale, was a statement of serious domestic investment. The enthusiast press, including titles like Practical Wireless, often praised the solid construction of these premium sets. It was an era when the physical presence of a radio, the satisfying mechanical clunk of its waveband switches, and the warmth of its tone were deemed just as important as the voices it projected. This was the absolute peak of the British domestic listening ecosystem. When a family gathered in a sitting room, adjusting the illuminated tuning dial of a Murphy radiogram to catch the evening news from Broadcasting House, or when a teenager placed a Bush portable on a Formica kitchen table to hear the weekend chart show, they were not just operating an electrical appliance. They were participating in a national ritual, underwritten entirely by British engineering, British labor, and a completely self-sustaining domestic market. Yet, this massive industrial fortress possessed a fatal structural arrogance. The Rank Bush Murphy factories in Plymouth, Chiswick, and Welwyn Garden City were vast, heavily unionized, and fundamentally reliant on traditional, expensive assembly methods. The Rank organization assumed that the British listener would always be willing to pay a premium for a familiar high street badge, a locally built wooden cabinet, and the comforting weight of a domestically engineered chassis. They did not foresee that the global definition of a good radio was about to change drastically, from a lasting piece of furniture that anchored a room to a cheap, disposable piece of plastic imported from the other side of the world. In the late 1960s, Rank Bush Murphy appeared absolutely invincible. To the casual observer walking past a high street shop window, the sheer volume of televisions, radiograms, and portable radios bearing the Bush and Murphy badges suggested an empire that would endure forever. But beneath the polished wood veneers and illuminated tuning dials, the structural foundations of the company were already fracturing. The decline of British radio manufacturing was rarely caused by a single catastrophic product failure. Instead, it was brought about by the slow, suffocating pressure of overlapping market forces, forces that the Rank organization fundamentally misunderstood. The first fatal mistake was internal. When Rank acquired Murphy Radio in 1962, they promised to maintain the distinct, high-fidelity acoustic engineering culture of the Welwyn Garden City factory. That promise was almost immediately abandoned by corporate accountants. To combat the severe burden of British cabinet, valve, transistor, component, labor, and manufacturing costs, Rank introduced a ruthless policy of badge engineering. Badge engineering, the practice of placing different brand names on identical, mass-produced internal chassis to create a false illusion of consumer choice, effectively destroyed the soul of both brands. By the late 1960s, a listener walking into a specialist radio dealer might pay a premium for a handsome Murphy table radio, a radio designed to sit on furniture rather than be carried in a pocket. Yet, if they removed the back panel, they would find the exact same printed circuit board, the exact same tuning capacitor, and the exact same loudspeaker as the cheaper Bush model sold in the discount catalog next door. The only difference was a slightly sharper cabinet design and a higher price tag. The acoustic moat that Frank Murphy had built in the 1930s was breached from the inside. A customer was no longer paying for superior engineering. They were paying for a piece of corporate theater. Furthermore, the rank organization's attention was fatally divided. In 1967, BBC Two began broadcasting in color, triggering a massive national scramble to upgrade domestic equipment. The transition to color television was incredibly expensive and technically demanding. RBM poured almost all of its engineering resources, capital and factory floor space, into television production, effectively starving the radio division of research and development. The radio set, once the undisputed primary focal point of the British sitting room, was quietly downgraded by corporate management to a secondary, low-priority object. While rank Bush-Murphy was distracted by televisions and bloated by the immense running costs of their massive, heavily unionized factories in Plymouth and Chiswick, the British market was hit by a devastating new reality: the force of imports, private labels, and good enough listening. In the early 1970s, companies like Sony, Sanyo, and National Panasonic began flooding the British high street with Japanese transistor radios. These were not the cheap, crackling novelty toys of the previous decade. They were precision-engineered marvels. A Japanese portable radio was smaller, lighter, and far cheaper to produce. While the RBM factories still relied heavily on long benches of British workers hand-soldering connections onto bulky circuit boards, the imported sets were assembled using highly automated processes. These foreign receivers bypassed the traditional British radio rental networks, a business model where customers rented equipment rather than buying it outright, because they were simply cheap enough for a teenager or a housewife to buy with cash. They bypassed the vetted specialist dealers. Instead, they appeared in discount electrical chains like Comet and Dixon's, in mail-order catalogs, and on the shelves of supermarkets. The new retail environment did not care about the historic prestige of the Welwyn Garden City Acoustic Labs, nor did it respect the legacy of the Bush Tree logo. It only cared about profit margins and the price on the shelf. Faced with this overwhelming pressure, rank Bush-Murphy attempted to retreat down market. They began to cheapen their own production to compete. The rich, real wood veneers that had defined the Murphy radiogram, a piece of furniture combining a radio, amplifier, loudspeaker, and record player in one cabinet, were quietly replaced by printed wood-grain plastics. The heavy, beautifully damped glass tuning scales were swapped for flimsy perspex. The satisfying mechanical clunk of the waveband switches was lost to cheap, unyielding plastic buttons. The British listener was suddenly presented with a stark economic choice. They could buy a heavy, increasingly plastic-heavy British radio with a familiar badge that felt noticeably cheaper than its predecessors, or they could buy a sleek, silver-trimmed imported portable for a fraction of the cost. The imported set might not have been designed to last 30 years on a repair bench, but it could receive the VHF FM signal of a local commercial station perfectly well. The market decisively concluded that good enough was exactly what it wanted, and the vast British factories began to run out of time. By the late 1970s, the economic reality of manufacturing consumer electronics in Britain was becoming impossible for the rank organization to ignore. Inflation was rampant across the country, and the domestic cost of producing a heavy wooden-cased mains radio, a receiver powered directly by the household electricity supply rather than batteries, was entirely unsustainable. The market no longer wanted a piece of acoustic furniture. They wanted miniaturized, portable convenience. In a final, desperate attempt to save their massive manufacturing infrastructure, Rank sought help from the very force that was dismantling them. In 1978, they formed a joint venture with the Japanese electronics giant Toshiba. The new entity, Rank Toshiba, was supposed to inject Japanese automated production efficiency into the vast British factories at Plymouth and Redruth. It was a staggering admission of defeat. The company that had once proudly built the definitive British acoustic instruments was now trying to learn how to survive from its direct competitors. It was an acknowledgement that the old British method of long benches, hand-wielded soldering irons, and heavy chassis construction was commercially obsolete. But the cultural and financial gap was simply too wide. The joint venture bled money almost immediately. The massive British factories, originally designed for a slower, more labor-intensive era of radiogram and early television production, could not seamlessly adapt to the rapid, highly automated assembly required to compete globally. Furthermore, the British consumer had already made their choice. They were no longer blindly loyal to a familiar high street badge. If a foreign alternative offered modern digital clock displays, integrated cassette recorders, and sleeker plastic styling for significantly less money. In 1981, the inevitable collapse arrived. The Rank organization, which was fundamentally an entertainment, film, and leisure conglomerate, finally lost its patience with domestic electronics manufacturing. They announced their complete withdrawal from the television and radio market. The partnership with Toshiba was dissolved, and the British radio empire was abruptly liquidated. The human and industrial consequences were devastating. The massive Ernesettle factory in Plymouth, once the absolute pride of post-war British industrial planning, faced catastrophic redundancies. Thousands of skilled technicians, acoustic engineers, and cabinet makers lost their livelihoods. The physical infrastructure that had built the famous Bush TR-82 portable and the premium Murphy baffle-board receivers was systematically dismantled. Rank did not mourn the loss of the engineering. They simply sold off the intellectual property. The Bush and Murphy names, once absolute guarantees of British reception and reliability, were sold to retail chains. They were transformed into zombie brands, stripped of their factories, their designers, and their heritage. The new owners simply bought cheap, generic electronics from overseas suppliers and slapped the historic British logos onto the plastic casings. The Plymouth lines stopped. The Welwyn labs closed. The service manuals became obsolete. The dealers cleared their shelves. Rank sold the names. The engineering culture died. The badges moved overseas. Only the empty cabinets remained. The physical collapse of the Rank-Bush-Murphy empire in 1981 did not mark the end of the brand names. It merely marked the end of their integrity. When the Rank organization walked away from domestic electronics manufacturing, they sold the famous trademarks to a succession of retail distributors. The British public, entirely accustomed to seeing the Bush tree logo and the Murphy badge on the high street, continued to buy them, largely unaware that the fundamental agreement between the manufacturer and the listener had been severed. The Murphy name suffered a quiet, slow demise, occasionally appearing on cheap imported budget televisions in the 1980s before fading almost entirely from the British retail landscape. It was a humiliating end for a badge that had once represented the absolute pinnacle of Welwyn Garden City's uncompromising acoustic engineering. The Bush brand, however, survived by becoming something entirely different. It was eventually acquired by the Home Retail Group, the parent company of the massive British catalogue retailer Argos, and later became the property of Sainsbury's, CQV. Today, a shopper can walk into a British supermarket and buy a Bush-branded television, a Bush washing machine, or a budget Bush DAB radio, digital audio broadcasting, a digital radio system that replaces a continuous analog signal with digital data. These modern devices are entirely disconnected from the factories in Chiswick or Plymouth. They are designed, engineered, and manufactured thousands of miles away by third-party global suppliers. The Bush name, once an ironclad guarantee of domestic British engineering, is now simply a private label sticker used to give unfamiliar imported electronics a comforting, nostalgic face. Yet a fierce and highly dedicated preservation community refuses to let the original engineering die. Across Britain, vintage radio collectors, amateur radio club members, and electronics historians actively hunt for genuine Bush and Murphy receivers. They scour eBay listings, Facebook Marketplace, car boot sales, and the dark corners of local charity shops for surviving examples. Organizations like the British Vintage Wireless Society champion the preservation of these sets. For these enthusiasts, restoring a 1950s Bush DAC 90A or a Murphy baffle board radio is an act of historical defiance. They source replacement glass valves, carefully clean the heavily oxidized tuning capacitors, and painstakingly polish the cracked bakelite cabinets. They do this because the original British sets still matter. An old rank Bush Murphy receiver, built before the era of badge engineering, does something that a modern, voice-activated smart speaker, a connected speaker that plays radio and music through voice commands and online services, simply cannot do. It makes the act of listening deliberate. A modern digital device provides instant, frictionless audio perfection. But a 1960s Murphy valve radio demands engagement. The listener must wait for the valves to warm up. They must turn the heavy, mechanically damped tuning dial, listening through the static and interference of the medium wave band to manually locate the broadcast. The physical weight of the cabinet, the glowing dial lamps, and the warm, resonant sound of the loudspeaker pushing air through a wooden grill all serve as a physical reminder of the sheer mechanical effort required to pull a voice out of the sky. The vast physical sites that once housed this immense industrial effort have largely vanished. The massive Ernesettle factory in Plymouth, which once churned out millions of televisions and radios under the RBM banner, was eventually sold off and carved up. Today, the site is an industrial estate, housing various smaller businesses and distribution warehouses. There is little indication that thousands of British workers once sat there at long benches, soldering the printed circuit boards that soundtracked the nation. In Welwyn Garden City, the original Murphy radio buildings have long been absorbed by modern urban redevelopment, replaced by offices and retail spaces. The physical fortress of British radio manufacturing has been entirely erased. There is, however, one final, profoundly ironic footnote to the rank Bush Murphy story. In the late 1990s and 2000s, the owners of the Bush brand realized the immense nostalgic value of their back catalog. They reissued the iconic Bush TR-82 portable radio as a replica, updating it to include modern FM and, later, DAB reception. On the outside, it looked almost exactly like David Ogle's famous 1959 design. It had the same chrome trim, the same large tuning dial, and the same distinctive handle. But if a technician unscrewed the back panel of the replica, they would not find a complex hand-wired chassis or a substantial ferret rod aerial. They would find a vast, empty plastic void containing nothing but a tiny, generic green-printed circuit board holding a single microchip, held in place by a dollop of hot glue. The physical object had been hollowed out. The design had survived, but the engineering had been replaced by an illusion. The story of Rank Bush Murphy reveals a deeply uncomfortable truth about the British consumer electronics market. It reveals a nation that loves the idea of domestic heritage, robust engineering, and familiar design, but fundamentally refuses to pay for it when offered a cheaper, imported alternative. The market praised the acoustic laboratories of Welwyn Garden City, but it bought the mass-produced plastic sets from overseas. The market rewarded convenience, and in doing so, it dismantled its own industrial capacity. Yet, long after the Ernesettle assembly lines fell silent, and long after the badges were sold to the supermarkets, a fraction of that original promise remains. Somewhere in Britain, on a dusty wooden repair bench in a quiet garden shed, an original Bush valve radio sits plugged into the mains. Its heavy bakelite cabinet is warm to the touch. Its glass valves are glowing orange in the dim light, and its illuminated tuning dial is waiting for a hand to turn the knob, proving that the original engineering can still find a voice in the dark. See you in the next one.